So, last big speech of the day, of the conference. Bit of a challenge, keep you awake before lunch. So I wanted to get into something that might grab your attention. Instead of just talking about digital transformation, I wanted to make it more real. We don't work necessarily just in a digital world, we work in an industry. We have jobs, we have families, so I wanted to tell you some stories, narrative that's going to talk about what the future of work is going to be for your company, and for you, and for your kids. Now, one of the things to think about how automation works is it's going to combine technologies of all kinds. It's going to start at the stack layer in hardware, ubiquitous connectivity, data, analytics, artificial intelligence. It all blends together to drive forward how we're going to transform the industry. So one of the first questions I have for you is, it's a big worry for governments, for people. Is automation killing jobs? Right? The whole idea of the Luddite argument. Will automation take away our jobs and our kids' jobs? So my answer to that, it's complicated. When do you think this picture was taken? This is a gold mine. This is a gold mine in Brazil, and this is how they were mining it. They're using their hands. You can see that the ladder there looks like it's constructed barely out of nails here. In some parts, it's actually roped together, not with nails, but with vines. So when people talk about automation killing jobs, I say yes. Automation does kill jobs. It kills dangerous jobs. It kills dirty jobs. It kills the jobs that you and I don't want to do, right? It kills the jobs that you go to school for in order to not be in situations like this. We think about the future of mining today. Suncor already has autonomous self-driving Komatsu vehicles in Fort McMurray. So what's the future of automation? Well, you've got here a multi-hundred-ton truck worth millions of dollars. The tires alone are worth about $55,000 each. The tires have sensors on them. They're instrumented, so you know how fast they're eroding. So you can control for safety concerns. A long time ago, one of my friends in engineering actually got a summer job as an internship, and they said one of the things that happened occasionally in Fort McMurray, especially in the winter when it's snowing, those things are so big that they will literally drive over a pickup truck and not notice. Because you're working a 12-hour shift in whiteout conditions, you're bored out of your mind, but if you're a full-time employee there, you're making $250,000 a year. So the self-driving truck has the ability to have sensors. They're aware that there's a Ford F-150 in the pathway, and they probably shouldn't drive over it. Probably. I mean, it depends what your rules are. So one of the things to think about in terms of how automation plays out is it augments our work. Ideally, it doesn't replace us. It changes what we do. It changes how we do it. But in terms of how it's played out in the last couple of decades, we've seen reductions in manufacturing across the Western world. If you look at the OECD stats, manufacturing jobs were in decline and then stabilized. But the really interesting thing is, robots didn't necessarily take the jobs. The jobs moved to different places in the world. So when you think about the countries that have the fastest, deepest integration to robotic manufacturing, they don't have unemployment problems. Korea, Singapore, Germany, Japan, Sweden, none of those places are facing mass unemployment because of robots. The robots let them do their work better. It lets them do things differently. So in a sense, automation is going to come for us all, but it'll let us do things better and differently. So IDC has entire maturity scapes about how to think about digital transformation, how to think about each industry. One of the things to think about is, in terms of automation, the degree to which you're going to automate the task or the job that you think about. So in this case, human-led, we've had automation, in a way, you could say all the way back to the Babylonians, right? Like, you go back all the way to Babylonia and think about how they controlled water for irrigation. And we move along this time frame, and suddenly we have machines in the industrial age. And you start thinking about human-led. They think through how the factory floor will work, machines support it. One of the ideas I wanted to get across is, this is coming for professional white-collar work as well. It's not just physical machines that are being automated. If we think about where machine-controlled or machine-led human-governed automation is going to get to, one of the first places it'll come for is the IT world, because it's easier to do automation in an all-digital environment than it is in a physical world. So we're going to see a range within inside your company of what gets automated first, and whether it moves to a black box, entirely artificial intelligence world on the very, very far right here, where it's machine-controlled. We can't quite understand the algorithms or the output for why the machines are making the decisions that they are. That's how it's going to play out. I would argue in Canada, most companies sit somewhere in the sort of human-led, machine-supported, machine-led, human-supported at best. There's very few that are on the further right. Will that provide a competitive advantage? Probably. So at some point, you're going to have to think about how to bring your company over to the right. And that leads to an interesting quandary for all this digital transformation talk and the automation talk I'm giving here. Why do we do it? Why do companies want to invest in automation, digital transformation, and industry transformation? And I would say that there's really two reasons. This is the first one. How many people in the room play golf? Or play at golf, depending on your level of ability. So I'm terrible at golf, to be honest. But one of the things that I use as an analogy here is I don't need to be a PGA player. I don't need to drive the ball 400 yards. I'm never going to be able to drive the ball 400 yards. Actually, I'm not flexible, I'm not strong, I'm not very tall. So I'm never going to be able to do that. But if I could just stop hitting it into the woods, it's going to help me win a lot more bets, right? So, or actually, improve my score too, but really I care about more of the bets. So when you think about how to do this, if I could just stop putting the ball in the woods, if I can stay on the fairway, my life will get better. And that's the same for companies. If you could just stop making mistakes, you will see net improvement to your bottom line. You will see net improvement for how you can hire and treat people. And I'm going to give you some examples of how to make fewer mistakes. And I'm going to start with my favorite, beer. So the Internet of Beer. It's an interesting idea. There's actually numerous Internet of Beer technologies out there, including for home brewers. And one of the things to think about is Carlsberg started tracking and tracing all of their kegs. Why? Turns out a keg, net new, is $150. They have millions of them. They don't know where they are. You add up a couple thousand lost kegs, and all of a sudden you're missing your quarterly because you're buying new kegs. So they started putting RFID tags on them. Then they moved from RFID to other connected technologies. And one of the really interesting things they found was once they start down the path of transformation here, once they take an inanimate, dumb object like a beer keg, and they start tracking it, they have data flows that they could then analyze and do better with. So they started doing more stuff with it. They started tracking and tracing how long had the keg been at a pub. Because then they could reach out to that pub and say, beer's stale, please switch it over before it impairs the performance of that beer. It tastes stale. So we want to make sure our brand performance is better because you're not serving stale Tuborg or Carlsberg, depending on which particular sub-brand it is. They could do other tracking and tracing. Which ones are doing better? Which one of the distributors or logistics intermediaries is actually doing a quality job? So they found all these secondary and tertiary benefits from simply connecting physical assets, turning it into a data stream, and then analyzing it. And the people who started it were just literally the operations guys who were saying, where the hell are the beer kegs? Because they couldn't find them. So that's one example. The other fluid I depend on for life isn't really blood, it's coffee or beer. So we'll go to the coffee example. So this is Flavia. It's a office coffee product. Mars makes them. And they're not very exciting. If anybody likes coffee, they're not actually very good at making coffee. But what's really interesting to Mars is they found out the customer satisfaction for them depended on a few things. One was out of stock, because Mars didn't distribute the actual coffee, the coffee packs themselves. They usually went through third-party distributors. And they kept getting out of stocks. And the research on out of stock shows that in the retail world, out of stocks cost most retailers somewhere around 4% of their net margins. That's not revenues, that's margins. If you can just not have an out of stock, you will keep your customers happy. You will actually improve your profit margin because they won't look and turn to other vendors or pick a less satisfying product. So by using telemetry data, they could actually work out and send notifications to make sure that nobody ever runs out of coffee, which sounds fantastic. The other thing they started doing was using telemetry in the device itself, so that you didn't get situations where it was jammed up, so that they could check that the heating was actually going up to, say, 98 degrees Celsius. They could have a better performing product that performed like the schematic said it would without actually having to spend much more on it. They just needed a little more data. Now I'm gonna look at an average table here. That one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so you're 2 people short. One person at that table is likely to have food poisoning this year. Right? So these are things that matter to you. And I'm showing you lettuce here for a reason. How many people like Chipotle? How many people used to like Chipotle? Used to, exactly. Chipotle, when they had their E. coli scare, lost 30% of their market cap. 30%. They still don't know which supplier was the one who provided them with the lettuce that was off. They still don't know after losing billions of dollars of market cap. So when we start thinking about, you could call it the Internet of Farming, but it's not. Every industry has their own term for how digitization and automation is working. It's precision agriculture. When you start actually instrumenting it, you can track things. You can reduce spoilage. And spoilage is another really interesting area for agriculture. Agriculture depends on the ground, on the sun, on the rain. Turns out, actually, we do a really bad job of being efficient in agriculture. Worldwide, almost 40% of all the crops and protein that is grown for humans spoils before we eat it. Somewhere in the value chain. In the field, it starts rotting. It goes to a warehouse, it starts rotting. It gets on a truck and the truck doesn't have cold chain. It goes off. It gets to the store. It doesn't get to the storefront fast enough. It goes off. 40%. Think of the margin there that you're losing on a day-to-day basis because we haven't yet automated the system well enough. And so when I think about this, going back to the beer example, this was one of the first, I think it was the first autonomous transport truck in North America. It's auto, and it was driving Budweiser. And on the highway, the driver disengaged, and it was an autonomous vehicle driving the truck down the road. That's not really why I wanted to show it to you. There's the cold chain aspect where you can have sensors, and the sensors make sure that we reduce that 40% margin of food being thrown out. But really what I want to talk to you about is one of the reasons why this exists, not the self-driving car, but all this data and telemetry data. In the US, they have changed the rules for how long a truck driver can be on the road because they were killing people. So there's new rules on it. And what they found out was people took paper, they wrote down the hours, and they lied consistently. Something like 75% of all the logs ever submitted were wrong. Like, people lie. The other thing that happens with paper logs is you hand it in, somebody has to transcribe that into a digital format, which is a giant waste of time and money. So what they then did was mandated ELD, electronic logging devices. So as of December 2017, every transport truck in the US is mandated to have hours of service digital logs. Either plugs in basically under the driver's knee, or it ties to the engine compartment itself. And it sends that data back so you know exactly how many hours the driver spent on the road. And it flags immediately if they're going to go over, which hopefully means for safer roads. So the interesting thing here isn't the regulation, although regulation comes for us all in its own way. It's that the smart companies in the logistics and the trucking and the transportation industry, when the ELD mandate came down, instead of settling for bare bones where it literally just sends a tiny little bit of telemetry data saying, yes, this person has now driven for 7 hours, they realized that was the building block, the atomic structure that they could then build off to do things that actually added value and weren't just a cost. The smart companies started looking at, hey, if we've got this telemetry data, we can actually coach our drivers so that they can be more fuel efficient. We can coach our drivers to lower our insurance because they're not running through reds. They're not getting tickets. We can coach our drivers to do other things, like perhaps we could actually get them to do load pickups. So instead of having a half-done load, you can use that telemetry data because you know where it is in time and space to actually pick up more loads en route. So you're changing your logistics. And then you can add other elements, predictive maintenance. So your truck doesn't go out of service because the engineer and the mechanics already know that the part's going to fail before it does. And that part of predictive maintenance is really important. Most of us are never going to go inside a transport truck, right? We're never going to be in that situation. But a lot of us do things like take the GO train. And when we think about your company, my company, the GO train, one of the things to think about is that maintenance, nobody likes it. Right? It's the unsexy part of your job. Everything is new and shiny at first, but then it turns into a legacy thing. And people don't like investing in legacy. They see it as keeping the lights on. But a huge amount of your CapEx and your OpEx is devoted to maintenance. Doing maintenance better does a few things. One is the ability to actually have the sensors and the data, in this case Trenitalia, Italy's largest railway, they instrumented every wheel. They instrumented the track, they instrumented the chassis, they instrumented the actual engine. And the reason why they did that was multiple fold. One is they saw cost savings, right? As it says, 8 to 10% on 1.3 billion euros. That adds up. The other thing it did was it led to fewer derailments. One of the reasons why trains derail is you have a moving wheel on a rail. So if you look at Amtrak, they have derailed numerous times and killed people. Trenitalia would like to avoid that. That's expensive, it's bad for your brand, it's bad for the people on the train. So one of the things that happens is if you have telemetry data on every wheel, you can, in advance of it failing, pull it off and look at it. So this idea of investing and getting the data, that 700 terabytes of data a year that they're now getting, they never had that before. Right? They had schedules for maintenance just like we have for our car, change the oil every 8,000 kilometers. And that time-based schedule doesn't actually reflect how you use your car. Same thing goes for trains. Same thing goes for all sorts of factory floor devices. So when you think about predictive maintenance, here's another way to look at it. How many of you in the room have ever used Shazam? Right? It's an app on your phone. So you hear music, you're listening to it, and you're like, I know that song. I have no idea what the band is or what the song name is. So Shazam's a really clever app. It takes that audible noise, turns it into data, sends it to the cloud, it looks at it, sends it back, and says, this is the song, because it can track it against a database. So there are now multiple startups, Augury being one of them, that actually has Shazam, but for industrial equipment. They go to companies like Johnson Controls, they go to GE, and they have tracked the sound that it's supposed to be like. And they've also looked at all sorts of other vibrations, frequencies, pitch, to get the ability to take like the old, experienced engineer who might work at a plant and say, that doesn't sound right, that pump is making the wrong noise, and they can identify it through the ear. Well, now you can do that for your millennials through their app on their phone. Because what you'll find over time is the ability to take these data and have massive aggregated data sets lets you do things you simply couldn't do before. And in this case, it's to make sure that the plant doesn't shut down, right, or the pump doesn't fail. Another way to think about it is going back to will you lose your job, and going back to the counter-argument of maybe your jobs will just get augmented. So this is an Airbus plane under assembly. And planes are a fantastically interesting mechanical engineering specimen. There's well over 400,000 bolts on an Airbus. So Airbus had a small problem, though, because the goal of building an airplane has changed, not just flying people from place to place, but doing it with less and less and less energy used on the way. So one of the things that Airbus does is they looked at it and were like, well, we need to move away from using steel. Steel's heavy. And we need to find something lighter. So they moved to composites, carbons, right? When you do that, the problem is anybody who's ever had a carbon bike has this problem. One of the problems is if you start bolting into carbon and you don't torque it correctly, you suddenly, in my case, have a very expensive broken bike. In the case of an Airbus, you could do all sorts of other things that you don't want to do. So what Airbus decided to do to make sure that all the workers in the plant floor were actually doing it right is the tools that they use are now actually connected. They know the actual pressure that the bolt is supposed to be applied to, and they tell the worker. So while the worker is doing that, the tool itself is giving them instructions on the precise measurements. And you might think, well, it's a factory floor. This is the day job. This is what they do every day. There was an Air China flight about 4 years ago, that crashed near Taiwan. And the reason why it crashed was maintenance budgets, as I said, are seen as a cost center, so people outsource them. So one of the places that a lot of the world's planes now get maintained at is in China because labor costs are less. So plane goes to China, it's being maintained, takes off from China to go back across the Sea of Japan, bolt comes loose, bolt goes through the engine, destroys the engine, plane has to come down, it's on fire, plane is destroyed. Nobody died, which is good. But on the other hand, for the want of a precisely applied bolt, they took down an Airbus. So when we start thinking about how little things add up, the great thing about automation and digitization is you can stop hitting the ball in the woods. You can also do a lot more. And when we think about how you're going to do your job, this is the second most dangerous occupation in Canada. Forestry, which I did not realize that, but forestry is actually the forestry and fishery is actually tied for most dangerous job in Canada. But working in mines, working in quarries is an incredibly dangerous place to be. It's gotten better over time. Digitization, automation is making life better. We look at Canadian leading companies like Goldcorp, Barrick Gold again. One of the things they've done is they have wired the inside of their mine shafts using fiber optic cables and a variety of other means. They did it for a number of reasons. One was to get better data to the geologists and geophysicists. So when they did a drill blast, they would instantly get way more data than they had before, so they could pick veins and do a better job of literally just being a mine. But again, you have the infrastructure. It's digitized. You now have a digital fabric down there. So you can now do things like know where every single worker is in your mine, which then means it's tied to the blast system, which means you can't blast if anybody is in the vicinity of the explosives, which is good if you're in the mine underground. The other advantage it had, which is an ancillary benefit, was that now they can, in a case of emergency, know where everybody is to get them out. So you can avoid the situation like it was in Chile. So Goldcorp found they could get people out of a mine now about 45 minutes faster than they could before, purely because they knew where the people were. And speaking of safety, The current infrastructure deficit across Canada sits somewhere around $400 billion, and that's the estimated cost by engineers for what it'll cost to fix our bridges, our tunnels, our roads. And one of the reasons why is most of them were built in the 1960s as we expanded, right across North America, and they weren't built that well. Salt, water, it corrodes things. So Minneapolis, the bridge fell down in 2007. This isn't limited to the US. I'm not bashing the US, I just happen to have a picture of it. Montreal, if you take the road south, De La Concorde fell down 4 years ago, right? People died in Montreal because the failures of this. So how does this play out to digital transformation? This is the replacement bridge. When they built it back, they wired the bridge so it sends in real time all the data measurements to the engineers, the civil engineers, so they can keep a watchful eye on it. And they can build up a whole data set to understand what is happening to that bridge over time. They have an understanding of the yaw, the vibration, to know whether they need to go in and repair it or not. So this was one of the first of its kind, but now there's bridges in Florida. There's multiple other bridges where they're actually wiring the infrastructure that we drive on every day. The basic term in the industry is smart city, right? Many of us have heard of smart city. There's the Sidewalk Labs, Waterfront Toronto goal here. This is Barcelona. Barcelona is seen as one of the world leaders in being a smart city. And the reason is they started with an infrastructure. Post-Olympics, they had fiber optics when most of us didn't. And so they were used as a laboratory for testing all these things. So in Barcelona, they have advantages, right? One of the things that they can do is, easy one for them, for instance, is because their street lights are tied to the intranet, they can put more sensors on it. So they do put more sensors on it. They put particulate matter sensors so they know where pollution's coming from. They put noise sensors on it so they can preactively send the police to shut down issues in the street before they start getting 311 complaints. So it lets cities do the things that cities are supposed to do better without having to worry about people calling in and using antiquated infrastructure. There's all sorts of new things that are going to happen with smart cities. And you might think, that's in Europe, it's Barcelona, or the case of China where they're building new cities. But actually, Mississauga already has smart streetlights, right? We see this in Canada today. You have things like garbage bin levels, where cities, instead of having a pre-programmed route for which garbage bins they're going to pick up, when the garbage bin tells them it's full, they dynamically reroute the garbage truck, so you're only sending people to pick up and empty garbage bins that are already full. And the issue here usually isn't the technology, and it's not so much the process, it's dealing with the people and changing their environment to a dynamic infrastructure. But it's not that hard. So Ontario now mandates that every snow truck, right, every plow has connectivity on it. Because if they want to contract with the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario, you need to let them know in near real time whether you put your blade down and at what GPS location. When did you bring the blade back up? How much brine did you deploy? And one of the reasons for that is the Ministry of Transportation was sued after a car crash when it turns out one of the subcontractors didn't do their job. So all of a sudden we see digitization happening in places that you don't expect it, right? Nobody ever thinks about the internet of snowplows, but they're there. Bringing it back to things that you and I are more likely to interface with on a day-to-day basis, typical example of a supermarket. One of the reasons I bring this up is supermarkets are incredibly wasteful. If you think about how it works, there's open fridges in that picture, open freezers even in that picture, because they let us browse through things, but they're just wasting energy. Roughly 1/3 of all energy produced in Canada is used to heat, power, or light buildings, right? Going back to this stop hitting the ball off into the trees and keep it on the fairway, if you can just cut that down by using smart sensors and technologies to make sure that the fridge is actually the temperature it's supposed to be, that's going to save huge amounts of margins. And it goes on from that because you can also do things like stop the spoilage, right? Going back to that 40% of food being spoiled on the way. If you know that the fridge is on the fritz, instead of sending a teenager being paid minimum wage to check the temperature of the fridge once a day, just automate it. It will ping you when it's got the wrong temperature. High margin products are the ones that are kept cold. If you're in the retail business, meat, high margin business. Ice cream, super high margin. Well, if ice cream starts getting crystallized, customers are very, very unhappy. And they don't go back to you, right? They turn to a different retail. So one of the things to do is think about how can you turn this temperature data into a way to save you money. And for many of you, you're like, I have a Nest at home. Like, this is child's play. I've already done this type of stuff in my own living room. Speaking of child's play, one of the things to think about is how this data is changing healthcare. So this is a really cool project that IBM did in concert with the Hospital for Sick Children, and now it's spread around the world, which was that they started taking all the instrumented data from neonatal care facilities and work out what could they do with that. So if you think about, you go to the hospital, you're sick, you're in a bed, there's a clipboard at the end of the bed, they take down maybe your temperature, maybe your blood pressure, maybe your resting heart rate. That's actually not all the data they have. Most hospitals are tracking the data in real time, but then it wasn't necessarily kept. And one of the things about Project Artemis that was so cool was by using streaming analytics and basically big data technologies, they're taking 500 readings a second on neonatal infants because they're basically so fragile. And so how do you keep them alive? And when they compiled this data and they started looking through it and they started correlating scores between things like the baby's temperature, the resting heart rate, the way the blood was passing through, they realized they could predict whether the baby was going to get sick 6 to 8 hours ahead of any human idea of that. Right? The precursor data would show them that this baby is likely to get a fever. And they could take intervention, whether through antibiotics or other means, well in advance of any damage to the kid. So it led to savings in terms of renal, right? Kidney failure. It's helped with eyesight for neonatal care. These are real savings, and it comes down to basically doing a better job of having sensors, connecting the sensors, adding the data, and then really thinking about what can you do new and differently with that data. And that's the other point. So if part one of this was stop hitting the ball into the woods, the other thing is to start thinking about how you can do something different. And I've got Steph Curry here, because one of the things that's really fascinating about Steph Curry is he's not the tallest guy in the NBA, he's not the strongest guy in the NBA, he's certainly not the fastest guy in the NBA, but he's revolutionized the sport. In a way, he's moved it to what's called pace and space, because he's willing to take and make three-pointers from distances that nobody thought was reliable before. If you look at the average shot from Curry, it's not just at the three-point line, it's actually behind it, which pulls defenses further out, which then means they can run plays that isolate people in the paint as well. So when you think about how the Golden State Warriors win, yes, they've got amazing talent. Kevin Durant, Curry, Klay Thompson scoring 14 threes last night. But part of it is also rethinking. Everybody has the same rules. Three-point line's there for everybody. But they were willing to think, well, why don't we take shots on a consistent basis from 25 feet? Because we can make them if we practice hard enough. And they do. They've done something different. And my argument here is you need to do things differently as well. Tesla does lots of things differently, including tweeting. And I would really not advise tweeting like Tesla. But one thing they do incredibly well is after-sale service. Most of you, if you think about how it works for your car, once you bought it, it is a depreciating asset that gets net worse every time you drive it, right? It's a horrible way to look at your car, because most of us like our cars. But you spend a lot of money on it, you drive it off the lot, it loses money. Sits in your driveway, loses money. Tesla did something kind of cool. They sent patches over the air that actually improved the torque and acceleration of the car literally while it was sitting in your garage, because they improved the underlying software of the car. So if you're a Tesla driver, you just don't think about it sitting there depreciating. You're like, I wonder when I'll get something cool again from Tesla, like self-driving capabilities, which weren't just sent to the cars that were being built. It was sent as an over-the-air patch to some of the pre-existing cars. So all of a sudden one day, holy crap, my car can drive. Right? Most people, when you think about the ability to manufacture something and sell it, don't have that ability to reach out and delight your customers after the sale. The other thing that digital transformation has done in the last decade is this search for recurring revenues. And why I've got this up here, aside from loving the movie and Sean Connery, is that venture capitalists and the equity markets really appreciate recurring revenues. I think somebody said it earlier, predictable stream of revenues are worth a lot. Selling hits, where you build something and then try and sell that at CapEx, is valued less by the equity markets. So we've seen not just software companies like Adobe. Obviously, Adobe changed their entire business model to the Creative Cloud so they could stop people from just sharing old versions of Photoshop. Now you have to pay a monthly fee. Office 365, same deal. That predictable stream of revenue was valued more heavily and was actually harder to steal. But in the manufacturing world, it comes up again. So when I think about Siemens makes wind turbines, among many, many other things. GE also does these. When these first started getting built, third-party companies were the ones who serviced them because it was seen as an expensive, complicated thing to service. It cost about $85,000 to $150,000 per turbine per day to service because you've got to get a boat, a crane, in the middle of the North Sea. That's not fun. I would not want that job. What they did, though, was use telemetry data to get a handle on how to do that job better. Maybe they can change the pitch of the turbine blades while they're rotating to do a better job of not needing maintenance. Maybe they can find ways to optimize it. And so all of a sudden, given that Siemens has sold somewhere around 80,000 turbines. They had this massive data set, and they started realizing, you know what, we can offer this as a value-added service to our clients, and they do. So they're now making an income stream that is sitting somewhere in the multi-billion-dollar market for offshore wind turbine service. It's about an $8 billion market in total, and originally they handed that off to third-party providers, but because it's now got telemetry data, because they aggregated the data and started using machine learning to find patterns, they can offer services on it now that they couldn't before, and they can make it profitable, which they couldn't before. You're like, okay, Siemens is a really big company. I am not a really big company. I'm not GE, I'm not Siemens. So here's a Toronto-based company. Armstrong Fluid makes pumps, right? Pumps for HVAC, pumps for moving water, basically, or moving chemicals. And what's interesting is they have started deploying IoT. They've started deploying basically just connected sensors on top of their machines. Why? Well, a few things. One is they used to sell the pumps all around the world, but they had no idea who their customers were because it went through distribution channels. So they sold it to the distribution. The wholesaler then moved it to the Middle East or moved it to South America. They didn't know who their end user customer was until they got a call saying it's not working. Fix it. And so that was a very non-profitable way for them to deal with fixing things. Their support and their maintenance business was seen as a cost center. Once they started having the data coming back from the real world, it did a bunch of things. Their product engineers love it because they actually know how they work in the real world. They're suddenly getting data they never had before. They can optimize the performance of all these pumps. The other thing it does is it means you now have a direct connection to these B2C customers that was previously intermediated by a channel. So you have the ability to sell them on upgrades, not just that services line. So for Armstrong, which is a company of maybe 900 to 1,000 employees worldwide, suddenly this ability to have IoT has changed the way their financial outlook looks like. Same thing, when you start thinking about what can you do with digital transformation and automation, a jackhammer, right? People don't buy a jackhammer because they want a jackhammer. Well, as far as I know. What they really want is a hole in the ground, right? Like that's why you buy a jackhammer. You need a hole. And what you would like to do is buy a hole, but you can't. So you buy a jackhammer because it's the next best thing. They're expensive, and they're not actually used that often. Even the cities, like the city of Ottawa, say, they buy them. Mostly they sit in a warehouse, and then when they eventually get around to fixing the roads, in sort of like a 3-month period where they try to fix things, that's when they come out. They're expensive capital assets that aren't used. So Kaiser realized that they'd saturated the market effectively. Most people who need a jackhammer have a jackhammer. How do you deal with that? What they do is they're basically coming up with a leasing model that is entirely dependent on how much you've used it. How can they charge that accurately? How can they price that accurately? They get the data back so that they can price it based on compressed air, which is really how a jackhammer works. So effectively, Kaiser is charging people for compressed air because they have the data stream. John Deere's looking at it from a different point of view. If we have connected all these things and sold them to customers, how can we monetize that? And what they've done is monetize the data. So John Deere, when they sell these multi-$100,000 combines, harvesters, those are expensive tools. Like they run $500,000 or more. One of the things that they can do is they all come with GPS standard in them. So you know down to within a few centimeters of where you are in your farm. Because farms in Saskatchewan are big. Farms in North Dakota are big. When you're planting the corn, you could basically let the combine drive itself. Right? It's also private land, so you're not worried about regulations about whether you're going to kill somebody with your combine harvester. So that first thing about being able to drive yourself means the farmer can do other things. They can do their finances, they can do their expenses while they're in the combine. But the cool thing for John Deere wasn't that. It's that now they have this giant set of data right across the world of how farms really work. Precision agriculture at its best. They know how the seeds are going to do depending on what the moisture levels were. They can check the pH balance. They can offer suggestions to the farmers to do their jobs better. And they do, and they charge for it, right? So John Deere now has a recurring revenue line. They sell this for $500,000 or more, and then they add on a data stream for a monthly recurring fee, and they can get those extra tailing revenues. The interesting thing, though, is some of the farmers are kind of pissed about that because if you're a farmer, you're like, that's my data. You're taking my data and selling it back to me. That seems frustrating. And this is leading into an interesting quandary of how do you deal with data monetization? So Kins is a fairly interesting little startup. It does digital thermometers, but they're wirelessly connected digital thermometers that go to your app. And the reason for this is anybody who's had a young kid knows that young kids only ever seem to get fevers in the middle of the night. They never do it at 10 in the morning. Right? Like if you've got a toddler and the toddler's whining and complaining and crawling into your bed and screaming, they're not going to do that after you've had your second coffee of the day. They're going to do that at 3 in the morning. So you might check their temperature to know whether you have to go to ER or not. 45 minutes later, you have no idea what the temperature was because you're so fried from the screaming baby and you're exhausted. So in theory, it keeps a profile of all the times you've measured it, puts it in the app so then you can track the record. So when you eventually get to see your family doctor, you can show here's the trend data. So it's kind of an overpriced app for wealthy parents. It makes sense. Well, you know how they're awesome monetizing their data? They aggregate it and they sell it to advertisers. Parents didn't know they did that. So that's not super cool when they're selling off your kids' vital signs to Clorox, so Clorox can precisely advertise on Facebook groups like the Bridalwood Parents or Beach's Parents Group or Beach's Moms, so they can precisely target who's getting sick first. That happened originally on Google Search. Google Search was one of the first people to do this, if you think about it. The flu trends, which worked with the Centers for Disease Control. Now, Silicon Valley product companies are doing this as a data source because they want recurring revenues because that's what venture capital, that's what private equity, and that's what the market wants. You're like, okay, well, that's Silicon Valley. They do all sorts of heinous things in Silicon Valley. Like, just look at Facebook. Who drives a GM car? Anybody in the room drive a GM car? Right. So GM, this summer, tracked over 30,000 people in Chicago and LA on a minute-to-minute basis in terms of where they were, what radio station they were listening to, how loud was the radio station, how fast were they going, where did they start and stop, why? So they could aggregate the data and sell it to advertisers. Did GM tell anybody who owns a GM car that they were doing this? No. You know how it came out? Because they went to the National Association of Advertisers in the US and bragged about it. That's how it came out, right? So even old line industrial companies are, first off, digitally transforming themselves, but secondly, they're walking very quickly into dubious territory from an ethical standpoint. And when you think about the people in the room and what your day jobs are, you guys are technologists, right? You guys help guide the future IT architecture of your entire business. But the future is digital. So you're not just guiding the technological underpinnings of your company, you are setting up the framework for what your company will do, which borders it will cross, what lines it will cross. And you need to expand the strategy and the planning beyond just which vendor do we work for, what's our architecture, what ecosystem do we want to play with, into stuff like, is this long-term something I'm comfortable doing? I mean, for Google, they're happy to sell you anything, so they probably are happy selling your data. But is it something that your company, is it going to work with your branding? Is it going to work with your personal ethics? Those are issues that you now have to confront that you didn't 10 years ago. So this is the point where I usually get into guidance, right? Like, here's the 6 things that you guys can do to help keep your company going, digital transformation. And I often go through these kind of, they've been repeated so often they become cliches, even though they're accurate. I'll get to it. It's not that exciting. So one of the things I wanted to do instead was, how often do you do a strategy plan for your team or for your company, right? Most companies have, they have an annual one. Sometimes they have a biannual big one. It's not necessarily an iterative process. Usually there's one big sort of strategy planning session. One of the things that the US military does on a regular basis is what's called a red team operation. So they plan out basically a war game. And they pick somebody who's generally seen as being a bit of a pain in the ass to captain the red team. He gets to be the commander of some loosely named, usually Middle Eastern state, and fight back to see whether their plans to invade some Middle Eastern country would actually work. So I would invite you guys to start thinking about how you're going to red team when this guy comes from you, right? So for those in the room who don't know who this is Jeff Bezos, right? So in the words of, if you remember that terrible show from the 1990s, like, what you going to do when he comes for you? Because he's going to come for you. Now, we all know him from e-commerce, right? Like, they revolutionized the book industry. They moved into every other kind of retail packaging. It all shows up at your door. Great. That's trivial. Most people know that they do that. You probably didn't know that they're roughly about 45% of the entire e-commerce market in North America, right? So in terms of how big that matters, 4 to 4.5% of the North American retail market in total, they already have. Now, most people in the room, because this is the key audience for this, AWS, you are fully aware of AWS, started with EC2, S3, expanded into everything from Greengrass to Lambda to like whatever it is, like 90 different products every year that they launch in terms of AWS. And this is the data center in Virginia where most of Netflix actually gets hosted here, just if you were curious. But then they also spent somewhere around 800 million US on Kiva, which was a robot company. Why? Because they have revolutionized how warehouses look. They're still humans. They're one of the largest employers of people in the US. Ottawa just got a giant Amazon warehouse a few months ago, and they're one of the largest new employers in Ottawa. But the robots do all the moving of the parts, right? The people are there to help support the robots, going back to that scale of automation. The robots know where they're going, they know where the packages are, they just need the people to help pick and pack, because people are still cheaper than having robot arms for not crushing packages. So they're revolutionizing the whole world of logistics and distribution. So now they're not just e-commerce, but they're in-store. Amazon Go, already open in Seattle. So if you think about it, you don't have a cashier here. It's weighing things as you go, it knows what you've taken, and it charges you through your Amazon Prime membership when you leave. The only people in here at the moment, while it's still in beta testing, legally they need somebody in the liquor aisle because they need to check your ID. That's it. Right? So in a sense, what are they doing to retail? How does this play out when they start targeting the retail market across North America? Oh, right, they spent $13 billion on Whole Foods. So now they have bought a class of customer who is in wealthy neighborhoods right across North America, but they also have these big, large warehouses in every rich neighborhood in North America that they can sell Amazon Prime stuff for and help solve their last mile problem. Right? Because they're there. And it leads to Amazon Fresh, because now they have fresh food there. So they've got their distribution tied to that. So they're starting to think about how to revolutionize not just groceries, but food delivery. You're like, okay, but I knew that. Did you know that they own well over 40 different planes? They have their own airport. One of the things that's happened is they've already signed up and done the registration to do overseas freight. So they're thinking about getting into the worldwide freight business, from China to America mostly. That whole thing about drones, they have more patents on drones than you would think because they're trying to work out how to use drones to solve the last mile problem as well. So not only do they own 40 different full-size planes, they're one of the leaders in trying to think through how to use autonomous drones. And they're in your home, like literally in your home. It's kind of like a Halloween scary movie. So they bought Ring, again, somewhere in the $800 million US. That's one of the smart home locks. Why did they do it? Not just because it gives them an entry point into your house, it lets them do Amazon Key. So for all the people who've had packages dropped off their house and then stolen, well, with that, it can use facial recognition technology. Oh, they have facial recognition technology that they have commercialized and they've actually sold to the US police departments and now are selling to ICE, the Immigration and Customs business, for facial recognition of people. One of the things they'll do is use that on their own delivery teams. Because with Amazon Key, you sign up as an Amazon Prime member, they open your door, they put it in the front, they close it so you don't get your packages stolen. And in the case of groceries, they don't spoil in the winter or the summer. So why would they do that? Well, they can get in your house. Except they're already in your house because Amazon Alexa is the world's leading provider when you start thinking about how to use voice as an interface. Right? They have more partners, more APIs than anybody else. They're ahead of Google. They're well ahead of Apple in terms of how this plays out. And again, in a certain sense for machine learning, having more data lets you do more things better and faster. So they're there. And you're like, okay, well, I'll just go sit in the couch. This is too much to think about. And I'm going to watch Prime Video. So they're in the entertainment market. But they're also in your kids' entertainment market. So if you know about esports, people now watch other people play video games. Not really sure why. I'm clearly the wrong age group for it, but this is a thing. So people watch other kids play Fortnite online. Amazon owns Twitch. They paid a lot of money for it, but what it does is it gives them a hook into the next two generations of audiences who are watching streaming media over their devices like phones and tablets. If you sell goods on Amazon, you're competing against Amazon. That's a private label that Amazon runs. They have 6 of them right now, right? And they give them boosts in the advertising, so you don't know that that's run by Amazon. You just click on it because it looks good. Oh, and for the commodity stuff that you have a dash for, so you hit a button, it just reorders dish detergent, soap, batteries, Amazon Basics. So they're cannibalizing their own suppliers because there's profit there. They can take their spot in the value chain because they're the brand that matters. They're on track to get well over $4 billion in advertising this year. So if you're in the advertising and media market, and you're like, I don't do physical products, I'm not worried about them. $4 billion in advertising revenue, because when you go to Amazon, you have indicated that you are going to make a purchase. When you go to Google, you could just be browsing for any kind of crap. So an ad on Amazon is likely to actually sell something. It's worth a lot, so they sell it. Hey, here's another $1 billion. They bought PillPacks. Now they're one of the largest online pharmacies in the world. Oh, healthcare, large, complicated, big problem, and going to get worse as we all age. Amazon has teamed up with JP Morgan Chase and Berkshire Hathaway. So they are now in the US trying to work out how to untangle the giant hairball of US medical system with HMOs and everything else to do a better way of doing that. Because again, data plus money, they see a long-term playbook here. You're like, oh, that's fine, I'm a bank. This can't possibly come for me. Yeah, but they can unbundle you. So one of the ways to think about it is they have credit cards already. That plays up against the banks. They have cash, they have lending, they have Amazon Go, which is a payment system, really. So they are coming for you no matter what industry you're in. Now, the diagram here on your left, that's one of the original things that he drew on a napkin, right? How will Amazon work? If we have the biggest selection, we will have the best customer experience. That drives traffic, which drives scale. We'll bring people onto our platform, we'll charge them for that, make more money off our scale, get bigger and bigger. And by investing upfront in these fixed costs, we will do a better job of serving our customers, which then lowers the price, which drives more traffic, and it's a whole bunch of virtuous flywheels, effectively. You can see this in the retail business. You can see it in AWS. Because they are so big, they can keep offering new services, which drives down price, which is hard for other cloud players to compete against. So the question on the other side is kind of interesting. That's one of their templates is, as he says, not what is going to change, but what won't. Customers will want things cheaper. They will want good customer experience. They will want you to be a good business. And what you need to do is work out how you can automate and digitize yourself before somebody comes over and does it for you. So when I said that these weren't that exciting, yeah, but they're still your homework. You've got to do it because otherwise Amazon's already done it and is going to do it for you as well. So I can go into more detail about those, but I don't want to take up everybody's time. And so I think maybe we'll bring to the next stage of the discussion when we have a roundtable. Thanks.